Parole camp in Annapolis is pretty much Anne Arundel County's claim to fame for the Civil War. It was a camp just for Union prisoners of war who had been released on parole by the Confederates. In June of 1862, they set up 3 parole camps. One was at Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, one was at Camp Chase in Ohio, and the largest one was originally here at the Naval Academy. And men who were paroled would be brought to the exchange point, or the release point on the East Coast was at City Point, Virginia. So all the paroled men would be brought there, loaded onto transports, sailed up the bay and put ashore in Annapolis. And if they were all in one place, all in one camp, then it was easy enough when they declared an exchange of 1,000 prisoners, you could find them and then send them back to their regiments. As the parolees began coming into Annapolis in the spring of 1862, there just wasn't any room to put them. Every square inch of open space in Annapolis was already occupied with a tent. So they moved the parole camp out about 2 miles southwest of Annapolis near Spa Creek. They thought that this would be far enough from town to keep the men out of trouble, keep the men out of the saloons in downtown Annapolis. And it would give them a lot of room to expand. But as it turns out, 2 miles was not that far for men to walk to go back to Annapolis to get into trouble. And they also pretty much ravaged the farms in the area, destroyed the crops, broke into farmhouses. And the other problem that the camp ran into is that even though they were out in the country and supposedly had all this room to grow, they were in the habit of throwing the trash from the camp right outside the fence. There was so much trash surrounding the camp that it was actually more practical to move the camp than to try and clean it up to expand. In August of 1863, the camp moved to its final location, which again was about 2 miles outside of Annapolis, almost due west. And that is where the community of Parole is now. The camps varied in condition according to the population of the number of men that were there. And that varied widely because after a large battle, you'd have an influx of maybe 10,000 paroled men. After a mass exchange, you might have 1,000 or 2,000 there. So when there were very few people there, it was feast. They had enough of everything. But there was usually not a lot of notice given to the camp when these thousands of prisoners would be flooding in. And in a lot of cases, men were sleeping outdoors. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have enough supplies. So it was really feast or famine there. The problems at the parole camp, because these were Northern soldiers, they had access to their own representatives, their own senators, and if the conditions were bad, they would write home. And then the senators and representatives would get on the Commissary General of Prisoners. So the complaints went full circle and came back to the poor commander of the camp, who was really doing his best, but it was very difficult to manage a population that fluctuated that much. Also, one of the main problems with the camp was that there were never enough guards. So men found it easy to just go over the fence and leave whenever they wanted to. At one point there were, a soldier wrote that there were 3,000 paroled men in camp being guarded by only 90 men. The problem was that the Commissary General of Prisons, who oversaw all of these parole camps, had no troops to call on himself. He had to beg, borrow, and steal from another regiment, and the other regiments weren't always able or willing to give men up. So throughout all 3 iterations of Camp Parole, it was very difficult to keep men under some kind of control, out of the saloons. And of course, Annapolis, as with a lot of Army towns, progressively got more undisciplined as time went on. By 1864, it was, one soldier described it as the worst example of an Army town. There were, before the war, you realized that Annapolis was just a little market town of a few thousand people. And by 1864, there were brothels, there were saloons, there were gambling dens. Men were constantly getting in brawls, people were assaulted. Murder was not uncommon. There were a lot of cases where civilians were found with their throats slashed and their clothes gone because the men in the parole camp were trying to get civilian clothes to desert in. How long a man was in camp had nothing to do with how soon he was released. Men were released by regiment to make it easier to take groups of men back to their own units. But sometimes those units could be hundreds of miles away. And as there were no guards to keep an eye on the camp, there were very few guards to send with these men, taking them back to the battle. So you might have 1 or 2 guards trying to escort 100 or 200 paroled prisoners who have now been exchanged and they're being sent back to fight again. And it was very common by the end of the trip back, the guard would have a lot fewer men than he started out with. They would just sort of disappear along the way. They didn't want to go back and fight again. There was also a problem with trying to get men back to the right regiment because a lot of men who couldn't read or write had no idea what regiment they had belonged to. So when they were brought into the camp, all the information was taken from them, name and birthday, birthplace, and what regiment were you in. They'd just say, I don't know. So it was a constant struggle to find out where these men belonged. Some of them lied because maybe they had shown cowardice in the face of the enemy, allowed themselves to be captured so they didn't get shot. They didn't want to get sent back to the regiment where people knew what they had done. So they lied about their regiment. So you see a lot of letters from irate regimental commanders saying, I got 100 men yesterday, none of them are mine. Why are you sending me these people? Lee surrendered in April of 1865, and within a couple of months the parole camp here in Annapolis was essentially gone. They had torn down the buildings, offered the wood for sale to local merchants and builders. The Naval Academy moved back. The hospital was discontinued. All the remaining patients in the Annapolis hospital were sent to other convalescent hospitals in other areas. And by the end of 1865, there really wasn't a trace of the camp left. It's not just the big battles that are exciting, Gettysburg and Antietam. There's Civil War history literally right in their backyard. Maybe the folks that live around the parole community could go out and dig around and see if they could find artifacts because, up till recently, before the shopping centers were built, people would find artifacts and relics of the camp everywhere. And I don't know whether too many of those are left yet, but the history is there, and I just want people to know about it.